The three of us decided it was time to take action and file a formal complaint because what was happening wasn't fair, and it wasn't something we should have to tolerate just to keep our jobs. The day I decided to file the complaint with HR was honestly one of the most validating moments I'd had in months because I finally felt like I was doing something concrete about Dan's unacceptable behavior instead of just suffering through it every single day. I'd reached my absolute breaking point the week before when we had this group lunch invitation situation that was so blatantly discriminatory that I couldn't ignore it anymore. What happened was Jake and Marcus were organizing this lunch outing to celebrate finishing a big project. Update 2. He speaks to every man in the office like an old friend, but won't even make eye contact with the women. After months of being ignored, we filed a complaint. HR promised an investigation, but when they called us back, they didn't discipline him, they blamed us. The department asked Dan if he wanted to join, and he immediately said yes, starting to talk about how he'd been wanting to try that restaurant for months. But then, when the conversation turned to logistics and Sarah mentioned she'd need to move some meetings around to make it work, Dan suddenly changed his tune and said he actually couldn't make it after all because he had other commitments. It was so obvious that he didn't want to go if women were going to be there, and honestly, it was humiliating for all of us. That same week, I watched Dan accept an invitation to grab drinks with the guys after work, joking around about how he needed to unwind after a stressful day. But when Megan casually mentioned that a group of us were planning to check out this new happy hour place and he should join us, he gave her this cold, "Thanks, but I have plans" response without even looking up from his computer. The double standard was so blatant and so insulting that I knew I couldn't keep pretending like this was normal or acceptable behavior. So, I scheduled a meeting with HR and asked Megan and Sarah to come with me because I wanted them to share their experiences too. I spent the night before organizing all the documentation I'd been keeping, specific dates and incidents where Dan's differential treatment was most obvious, examples of how his behavior was affecting our work environment, and evidence that he was capable of normal social interaction but was choosing not to extend that courtesy to the women in our office. The HR meeting went exactly how I hoped it would. The representative, Lisa, took our complaint very seriously and asked detailed questions about Dan's behavior patterns. She seemed particularly concerned when we explained how Dan's selective socializing was creating an atmosphere where the women felt excluded and undervalued compared to our male colleagues. When I showed her my documentation of specific incidents, she said it was clear that we'd been experiencing something that needed to be investigated. Lisa explained that what we were describing could potentially constitute discrimination based on gender and that creating different treatment standards for male and female employees was something the company took very seriously. She assured us that they would conduct a thorough investigation and interview other employees to get a complete picture of what was happening. I felt so validated hearing her say that our experiences were legitimate workplace concerns and not just us being overly sensitive, like I'd started to worry we might be. The best part was when Lisa told us that she'd be speaking with Dan directly about his behavior and making it clear that all employees needed to be treated with equal courtesy and respect regardless of gender. She said that if the investigation confirmed our complaints, there would be consequences for Dan and requirements for him to change his behavior going forward. Finally, someone in authority was taking this situation seriously and recognizing that what we'd been dealing with wasn't acceptable. After the meeting, I felt this huge sense of relief and empowerment. For months, I'd been feeling frustrated and helpless about Dan's treatment of us, but now I'd taken concrete action to address the problem. Megan and Sarah were both grateful that I'd initiated the complaint process, and we all agreed that we'd done the right thing by speaking up instead of continuing to suffer in silence. I'll admit part of me was looking forward to seeing how Dan would react when HR confronted him about his behavior. I figured he'd either have to apologize and start treating us with basic human decency, or he'd get defensive and reveal his true colors, which would only support our case. Either way, I was confident that the investigation would vindicate our complaints and force Dan to change his discriminatory behavior toward the women in our office. Everything started falling apart when HR called me back for what I thought was going to be a follow-up meeting to tell me about the consequences Dan was facing for his discriminatory behavior. Instead, I walked into that conference room and got hit with information that completely blindsided me and honestly made me question everything I thought I knew about the situation. Lisa started the meeting by explaining that they'd completed their investigation and had spoken with Dan about our complaints. But instead of telling me about his punishment or the behavior changes he'd be required to make, she started talking about his perspective on the situation and how he provided context for his workplace interactions. I was already getting a bad feeling about where this was heading, but nothing could have prepared me for what she told me next. Apparently, Dan had explained to HR that he maintained strict professional boundaries with female colleagues because of an incident at his previous job where casual friendships with women in the workplace led to harassment accusations against him. He told them that he'd been falsely accused by a female coworker who misinterpreted their friendly interactions as romantic interest and that the situation had nearly cost him his career and reputation. So now, he follows what he called a professional courtesy-only policy with women at work to protect himself from similar misunderstandings. I was absolutely stunned. Lisa was sitting there explaining this like it somehow justified Dan's behavior, like his past experience gave him the right to treat all women in the workplace as potential threats who didn't deserve basic social interaction. I tried to explain that regardless of his reasons, his differential treatment was still creating a hostile work environment for us, but Lisa seemed more focused on his legal right to maintain professional boundaries than on how his behavior affected the women in her department. The worst part was when she told me that several of the male coworkers had come forward to support Dan during the investigation. Apparently, Jake, Marcus, and even our supervisor had all confirmed that Dan had shared his previous workplace experience with them and that they understood and supported his decision to keep things strictly professional with female colleagues. I felt completely betrayed here. I thought these guys were our friends and coworkers, but when it came down to it, they sided with Dan and acted like his discriminatory behavior was perfectly reasonable. Then Lisa dropped the real bombshell. She said that during their investigation, several employees had expressed concern about the way Megan, Sarah, and I had been monitoring and discussing Dan's behavior. Apparently, people had noticed us watching him, timing our breaks to observe his interactions, and constantly talking about him among ourselves. Some coworkers had described our behavior as obsessive and uncomfortable, and a few. Final update. He speaks to every man in the office like an old friend, but won't even make eye contact with the women. After months of being ignored, we filed a complaint. HR promised an investigation. But when they called us back, they didn't discipline him, they blamed us. People had actually complained that we were creating workplace drama and making them feel awkward about their own interactions with Dan. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Somehow, we'd gone from being the victims of discrimination to being accused of harassment ourselves.
Because you were, in fact, harassing him. And now it's all coming back around. And look, see, he had a perfectly viable reason. And you can't tell somebody that you can't be business professional just because it makes you uncomfortable. So now it's biting her in her ass, and she still thinks she's the victim. Do you still think she's the victim? Did you ever? Because I sure as hell didn't. Let's talk about it.